institutional contribution made by Alberto Ibargüen, the contributions made by the commissioners, and I want to give special thanks to the amazing and dedicated staff of the Communications and Society program who worked extraordinarily hard to put this together. I am only going to take another few seconds because we're all so excited to hear from the commissioners and discuss these recommendations. The one thing that struck me, though, looking as when I first saw them and as they were being developed over a few weeks or maybe months getting to this point, is how some of these recommendations and themes of transparency and innovation and engagement and commitment run through so many other programs of the Institute as well. Even, for example, the commitment one with a suggestion of a commitment to a year of voluntary national civilian service, which is something that the Commission championed in a project here called the Franklin Project, which has gone on to great success as the Service Year Alliance. But the fact is that it's going to take a lot of work from a lot of institutions, as well as government and the private sector and the nonprofit sector, to move along these critical issues, which are probably among, if not the most important issues facing democracy, not just in this country, around the world. And I'm very pleased that there are so many other parts of the Institute who have overlapping interests with these goals and recommendations. So I want to thank again all of you for being here. A special thanks to all of the people who did the amazing work that led to where we are, and let the program begin. Thank you.
Good morning. Good morning. I'm Jamie Woodson, and I've had the privilege to co-chair with my colleague Tony this incredible group of leaders over the last 12 plus months. I want to thank first our partners with the Aspen Institute, Charlie Firestone and his team, the Knight Foundation, Alberto, Jennifer, and the teams. You all have brought together a pretty incredible group of people, and we deeply appreciate the opportunity that you have given us. It has been professionally meaningful, but it's also been personally meaningful as citizens. You asked us to dig into one of the greatest issues of our time and the crisis in our American democracy, and that's a crisis of trust. We all know and recognize that polarization and partisanship is at an all-time high, and trust in our bedrock institutions of our republic are at an all-time low. And so for us, this has been an important and meaningful endeavor, and we recognize as members of the Commission just how important it is to have cross-sector, cross-political leadership and action to help solve and rebuild this critical thing we call trust. I would also like to thank our colleagues on the Commission for their incredible work, the time that they have taken. We've gone across the nation together. We have learned together. We have received so much input and thoughtfulness from folks all across the country as teammates in this effort, and we've challenged each other. From the beginning, we challenged each other to be learners. We challenged each other to be problem solvers and solutions-oriented, and we challenged each other to be bold thinkers. And I think that you have accomplished the task that we've all asked and held each other accountable for. We're a diverse group of leaders. We are from all parts of the country. We have a great diversity in political perspective. We have different technical expertises, different occupations. And so I'm very proud that this group has modeled what we have called for so clearly in this report. And that is to dig through the tough conversations to get to meaningful recommendations that can move us and our nation forward. And so I want to thank my colleagues for that, and also recognize that in great candor, that process has not been easy. We on many occasions, through our conversations and exchanges with each other, have felt the rawness that we see and we experience every day in our country. And we recognize that. But we stayed focused, and we stayed focused and have the result, which is a unanimous report from this commission, and one that we believe will provide guidance and support as we together rebuild trust in democracy and in the media. And so we're very proud of that. Last, I would just thank the countless experts who have testified before us across the country, who have submitted their recommendations, who have helped us learn deeply together. I'd also like to thank the thousands of Americans through a variety of venues who have shared their feelings, who have shared their recommendations, and who have helped contribute to a better, more thoughtful report from all of us. Last but not least, I want to thank my co-chair, Tony Marks. Obviously, keen intellect. He also has a tremendous passion for our American democracy. And what I've come to really appreciate about Tony is his ability to find the third way and to find a way forward even when it seems like things might get bogged down. And that's not easy work, and it is greatly appreciated by your co-chair. So with that, my colleague Tony.
Thank you, Jamie. I just want to correct one false impression. I have no technical expertise of any kind. I also want to start by thanking our colleagues, the Aspen Institute, Dan, Charlie, the whole team. We've even added a junior member during this process, so we were productive in that regard. Thank you. And also, of course, the Knight Foundation, Alberto, Jennifer, the whole team there. The Aspen Institute and the Knight Foundation are pillars of our civil society. And this is just one more brick in reinforcing that wall. And it's an honor to be a part of it. And it was a particular honor to work with my fellow commissioners. As Jamie's already said, we came to see that we were in our deliberations modeling for ourselves, at least, the kind of hard, productive conversations that democracy needs. And I will just say, I learned a huge amount, and I'm in your debt, so thank you all. And of course, Jamie, my co-chair, who personifies the wisdom and graciousness of her state, of the South of the United States. A real treat for me to get to know you, and just the beginning of what I know will be a great friendship. Okay, off the script. Famously, when Ben Franklin left the Continental Congress one day, people came up to him and asked what kind of government the founding fathers would provide. Jeff was going to tell us whether this story is true or not, but Ben Franklin's response was, a republic, if you can keep it. I never thought in my lifetime, or thinking about my children's lifetimes, that I would be uncertain about our ability to keep it. But I am, and America is uncertain at this juncture. That line that always seemed like a bit of a throwaway or even a joke isn't. It's the most serious question of our day. Can we keep it? We know that in order to keep it, media and trust are essential, and they are both, as Jamie has eloquently said, deeply under threat. We need a media that will inform our citizens to make choices and selections, that will provide and ensure facts. Facts. Yes, Washington, there is such a thing as facts. Because without facts, we cannot check the power of those who lead us or want to lead us. We need the media's processes to be transparent. We need a media that represents us. And we need a local media. All of that is uncertain at this juncture. We have this amazing technology, which is not serving us well. We need a technology that doesn't reinforce our echo chambers, that doesn't distract us from the hard work of the mind and of democracy. We need it to be dependable, and we need to reaffirm that what you do with this platform and this technology belongs to you, not to the platforms. And that if you choose to take your wisdom, your friendships, your networks elsewhere, that should be absolutely your right. And trust. It all comes down to trust. We cannot trust each other if we do not know each other, if we aren't capable of talking with each other, of sitting with each other, of learning together. It's the work that happens in the library every day. It's the work that so many of us do, but we've lost that capacity as a nation. And we must find it. That's what brought this group together. It's what's inspired Aspen and Knight and all of us who are part of this process. I want to be able to say to my children that we will leave them with the strongest democracy that we can. We have work to do. This report is just the beginning of that work. And when I get back to my office tomorrow, some of you know Ben Franklin's portrait sits on the mantelpiece watching me with appropriate suspicion. I want to go back and say to Ben, we tried, we're moving, we heard you, we will fight to keep this democracy. Thank you all for being here.
I don't think Ben is suspicious of you. I think he's just skeptical. I'm Alberto Ibargüen. I'm president of Knight Foundation. We support programs that inform and engage communities. So needless to say, you'll hear echo from me of what Jamie and Tony have just said. We gathered with Aspen, 25 smart Americans who had some things in common, many things not in common, from all over. What they critically had in common is that they believed in representative democracy, and that representative democracy requires reliable information, and they believed that neighbors who have differences need to sit down and talk about it. I know that may be shocking to some people in this room, but it's what happens in America, and for a year and a half, that's what we did. Thanks to Jamie Woodson and to Tony Marks, we were inspired and instructed. We were inspired by their vision. We were instructed by their iron will to come to consensus and keep us there until we did. Thank you for all of that. Thanks to the 23 other commissioners who tackled this incredibly important, these incredibly important issues, and I will take a moment of personal privilege to point out one of those commissioners from Miami, Eduardo Padron, who just this week, trying to upstage the Knight Commission, announced his retirement after many decades as president of Miami-Dade College, having done an absolutely amazing job of community building in Miami. Thank you, Eduardo, for your service. Thanks to Elliot Gerson, of course, and the Aspen Institute for all of their tremendous support. This is the second time we've done this with Aspen. The first time was about 10 years ago. And that effort too, as was this one, led by Charlie Firestone, whom I first met 44 years ago, when as a legal aid lawyer who was challenging a bunch of television stations and realized I knew how to fill out the forms. I didn't really know anything about communications law. Called up the United Church of Christ, and there on the other end of the line was Charlie Firestone, who walked me through what turned out to be a successful process, even though I wasn't quite sure in the middle of it how we'd get to the end. Just like on this one, Charlie was the leader and calm presence throughout. And thanks to Christine Gloria, his wonderful right hand and leader in her own right. And finally, thanks to a lot of my colleagues at Knight, but in particular Jennifer Preston, who's our Vice President for Journalism, Andrew Sherry, our Vice President for Communications, and Sam Gill, Vice President for Learning and Impact and Communities. The Commission's work, as you've heard, I think comes at a very critical time. Internet has obviously transformed what we know, what we think we know, what we think of as facts, and therefore how we think about the world. Fortunately, we're at the beginning of that technological revolution, so this is a great time to question, to examine the effect of technology. We really are, to borrow from Professor Elizabeth Eisenstein, we really are at a Gutenberg moment, and it's not just a throwaway phrase. It's as real as Ben Franklin's phrase that Tony quoted. Before Gutenberg's mechanization of the printing press, there was order. The monks would illuminate a manuscript or two a year. The cardinal would give it his imprimatur. It's always his. Would give it his imprimatur, and there was, you knew truth. There was no doubting it. And after Gutenberg, any Tom, Dick, or Martin Luther could mimeograph whatever you wanted. And for 100 years, people were trying to figure out, how do you determine truth from fiction, and how do you deal with the incredible increase in the volume of information that was suddenly coming your way. I don't think without it, as Professor Eisenstein argues, you could have had the Reformation or the Renaissance, and I think that's the spirit in which we gathered to look at what this technology is going to do, is doing, and is going to do. The work of the Commission really reminds us that there's a lot that we can preserve, that bias is not unavoidable. That this is mostly true in local journalism, where the distance between reader and journalist is the shortest, and you'll hear a lot about that as these proceedings go on, as you read the report. Keep in mind that just as in society, we did reach consensus on a number of things, on a number of civic goals and proposals. We agreed in principle on others, the importance of free flow of information, the importance of free speech in a society. And we didn't find agreement on some specifics, like, for example, the regulation of internet or of platforms. That, to say otherwise would be to pretend that we were not dealing with the realities of this moment in time. But that gives us, I think, what this report is, and the way to really look at this report as Congress and the rest of society consider these issues. It gives us a base with a foundation. It's a foundation of fact and inquiry that gives us a model for how to go about this, of neighbors talking to each other with different perspectives in good faith. So I thank you all again for coming this morning. I'm as Cornel West once said, I'm not an optimist. I'm a prisoner of hope. And no matter what the evidence is, I still expect that we're going to go forward. So Tony, we intend to keep that republic, and I want you now to hear from Charlie Firestone, who will walk you through the report. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and you can see what great leadership we've had and support and partnership, and we really appreciate the partnership of the Knight Foundation, Jennifer Preston, who's shepherded this, not just in supporting it, but in leadership and insight. So we are very grateful to you. This is an auspicious day. It's not only the release of our report, but it's the Lunar New Year, and it's the State of the Union. So I don't know what the State of the Union is, but the state of our democracy is in crisis. And we're going to hear this. We already heard it with our co-chairs, and we're going to hear as we have our panels on the individual recommendations. The charge to the commission was to look at why there's been a decline in trust in democratic institutions and in the press specifically over the last 40 years. This has been a trend that's been going on for several decades. And what do we do about it? We did list a number of causes. We didn't give weights to them, but we looked at the poor institutional performance by government, the global shocks, particularly in technology, the polarization that Jamie mentioned initially, the increasing economic inequality and decreasing mobility as reasons for general distrust in our democratic institutions and in the press specifically, the proliferation of news sources. Now everybody is a news source. The disintermediation of news sources to their audiences, the confusion between fact and fact and opinion, which leads to perceptions of bias, the spread of disinformation, which is a very serious and important phenomenon we've just come across, the political criticism of the media, and the decline of local news, which is sad and happening even to the point of news deserts in many communities. But we did try to stick to specifically to trust and not try to solve all of democracy's problems or all of media's problems. So, you know, we did have to limit ourselves somewhat, and we tried to do that. So the structure of the report, which you now have in your hands, and hopefully for those who are watching on the webcast, will be able to find online. And if you want to discuss it, our Twitter handle is #NightCom with 2 M's. So we hope you will engage in a dialogue online. But the structure was, the first half of the report is building context. First, what is the importance of trust to a democracy and a healthy distrust? So yes, we need trust, but we also need to be skeptical and have that picture of Benjamin Franklin overlooking us in our minds, if not in our offices. We looked at the history of media and the new media environment and found a perfect storm of economic decline and some of the in the news business, the technological advances, and the polarization in our society. This commission was assiduously nonpartisan or bipartisan, but we came together. And so there is a discussion of government and media and the presidency in media. And just briefly, we do find that a robust press is an essential ingredient to a thriving democracy. So while we have 3 different sections, one on media, one on technology, one on citizenship, and all of them involve leadership, we think of these as integrated. So when we call for transparency, we call for transparency across all media, including technology. And we highlight, at actually Alberto's urging, we didn't want to create a map, we wanted to create a compass. And so we really focused on a lot of the values that we need going forward, including responsibility, free expression, transparency, literacy, innovation, and diversity. And you'll see those throughout the recommendations, how we try to enforce those values in the specific recommendations that we make going forward. I mentioned responsibility, and I reminded that the Hutchins Commission itself, which the Hutchins Commission was a report on the press in the late 1940s, looked at the press, the future of the press, and they said, they found it wanting, and they said, if you are not responsible, you're going to get regulated. Newt Minow, when he gave a speech to the National Association of Broadcasters and called broadcasting the vast wasteland, he urged them to be responsible or face more regulation. There's a lot of talk in this, while we do recommend some regulation, such as, and we'll hear about it, in sponsorship identification and information fiduciaries. We do urge all leaders, all people, to act responsibly. We're very proud this was a report that the rest of the country could model in terms of bringing together diverse viewpoints, diverse people, to come to consensus moving forward. So finally, I just want to thank people who have done a lot of thank yous. We thank the Knight Foundation, the commissioners, and particularly the co-chairs. I would like to mention, in addition to Christine, and she's the one who brought an extra member of the commission. She had a pregnancy during this, but Tricia Kelly, Sarah Eppenheimer, and Richard Adler, who was the primary writer, Nancy Watsman, Ethan Zuckerman, all deserve special mention. They've really brought this to fruition. So we're running a little behind. Thank you. Let's bring up the first panel, and which will talk about the media recommendations. So I guess I should mention while you're coming up, Charlie Sykes, Tom Rosensteel here, Rainey Aronson, Mizell Stewart, and Meredith Artley. Thank you. Let's start. Maybe Rainey and Mizell, who co-chaired a subcommittee, could start off with describing what the actual recommendations are in this.
So why don't we start with our favorite one, which is transparency. I think we started our conversations really talking more practically about transparency. How could journalists in a nuts and bolts way actually apply some techniques that we use at Frontline and across the industry? How can we make our work more transparent? And that actually grew into a much deeper and more profound conversation about transparency across the board. So as you'll look at the report, you'll really start to see that we're recommending radical transparency. We use that word very carefully and intentionally, and Mizell can talk a lot about that as well. But one of the things that we note is that, especially when it comes to journalism and trust, one way to build trust is to be intentional in how you share your sources, how you label what you do, from opinion to factual to non-opinion to news. And some of the recommendations we give are very practical. Some of them are actually cultural. So this is about how do you take the idea of transparency into the newsroom and into what you do as a journalist. So in other words, journalistic culture has often been to protect your sources, which also you need to do, but also to protect information. And our recommendation is to actually share more than you've been accustomed to sharing before, and to open up your notebooks, and in my case, open up your rushes, which are the film rushes that we use in order to make big documentary films, to actually have a welcome conversation with people who come to you to say, this is how we make decisions, this is how we tell stories the way that we do. And in addition to that, this is the additional information in journalism that can be at your fingertips.
Another way to really look at this, the transparency recommendation, is that journalists often assume that people know and understand what we do, how we do it, and why we do it. And we believe that that is a false assumption and that contributes to this almost pervasive sense of distrust. On my way to Washington yesterday, was reading a story that outlined actually an international example in Germany, where there's a scandal going on right now with Der Spiegel, one of the most respected publications in Germany, involving a scandal of fabrication, where a trusted award-winning reporter was found to be essentially making up stories out of whole cloth. And journalism as an institution is often quite self-policing. And it turned out that a partner, a writing partner of this journalist, was the one to begin to expose him, because he was concerned that a story that was provably false, that included his name, needed to be investigated. But there's that understanding really is not common or I think really understood among the general public. And so that in the transparency recommendations, we believe presents an opportunity for news organizations to explain in real time, here's how we do things, here's why we do things the way that we do them. And in so doing, peeling back the curtain as a way to increase trust.
Charlie Sykes, maybe you could describe how the transparency recommendations might address perceptions of bias.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I think this is one of the most effective things that the media can do, but I also think that, and I think that the Commission was very open to a discussion that, yes, there have been bad faith attacks on the media, but the perception of bias is not always wrong. There is real bias in the news media, and it has had catastrophic effects on credibility. Look, your number one asset in the media is, in fact, trust and credibility. And that is easily squandered through a lack of accuracy, through mistakes, and through a perception that you are not fair. And one of the things that we've seen, I think, over the last couple of years has been the delegitimization of many of the gatekeepers. And this has been a long time coming. I mean, you go back into the 1950s and 60s, and there were many, many critiques that the news media was biased, that it had double standards, that it was there was a great deal of groupthink. Conservative media, and I was part of this, grew and flourished specifically because there was an audience that felt they were not being served or respected. It did not just come out of nowhere. Now, what's happened, I think, is the equivalent of suffering from stomach flu and treating it by drinking battery acid. Because what's been happening is that rather than simply dealing with a question of bias and unfairness or the lack of ideological diversity in the media, has been this wholesale attack on the press as an enemy of the people. And the consequences of this are so grave. And I've told the story before, and again, being a conservative, pushing back on the audience when there was false news, fake news propaganda, because I thought it was important not to traffic in misinformation. And in 2015 and 2016, what I started noticing happening was that I was not any longer able to cite anyone in the media, any independent, credible source to push back on the fake news. And this came as a shock, and it probably shouldn't have been, because this has been going on for so long. So I do think that, and this is a very difficult period given the, how fraught our politics is, but I do think that the media needs to have deeper and more serious introspection about its biases, both conscious and unconscious, because we are now seeing the consequence that we are seeing some of the best journalism of my lifetime right now, some of the most extraordinary journalism being practiced, and yet 40% of America is not paying any attention and will not believe it. And so the restoration of credibility is going to be incredibly difficult. And I do think that the recommendations on transparency are extremely important.
So Meredith, into some of the other recommendations because we don't have a lot of time. And one area was innovation and some of the ideas for how technology and media can work to innovate in finding sources and that kind of thing, or determining sources and all. Maybe you could spell out a little bit of that.
Absolutely. So one of the things we discussed around this actually dovetails nicely with transparency. If you think about all of the explosion of different kinds of platforms, formats that a story can take, devices, and kind of this thing that we all feel that there's just a lot, and we're surrounded by never-ending feeds. And some of that is journalism and news, and some of it's entertainment, and just kind of an avalanche of this never-endingness. We've gone, you know, we're in that environment now where there used to be a little bit more of a sense of completion. You'd reach the end of a program or a publication. Those days are gone in many ways. So, you know, the innovation practices around transparency in particular haven't evolved as everything else around journalists and journalism has changed. So if you think about, for example, the ways that we, the news media, have ceded to the platforms some very important things. We've ceded a lot of the conversation that we have with our audiences, right? I know it's CNN. I made a decision several years ago to not have comments on the site anymore because, frankly, they were a disaster. It was just, it was counter to a civil conversation. There was no filtering software that could raise the bar of the conversation. And in the meantime, we were seeing the rise of Twitter, Facebook, and the like, and we said, we'll have the conversation there. That's actually where our audiences are. But in some ways, we ceded that conversation with our audiences to someone else's house who didn't necessarily have the same values that we have, right? So that was a lack of innovation. That was an opportunity to do something. I think that tide is turning now. I think we're starting to take some of that back. I know we're doing some of that at CNN, and I see a lot of our, I'd call it competitive set, but these days it just feels like sisters and brothers in other independent news organizations. We're all in this together right now, trying to think about ways to kind of own that relationship with our audiences a lot more. So the call for innovation, to me, is very close to the call for how we show our work. To Meisel's point, I think there are journalists who kind of take for granted that some of those things are understood. A lot of it's very nuanced, and it's really important to show who we are, how we do what we do, when we do get things wrong, because we're humans. How transparent are we in that? And that is no small challenge. It's not the same as, you know, printing a correction file on, you know, page 2 of the paper anymore. It's a lot more nuanced to how we clarify and update and when we change something and why, and being very transparent with audiences about that. Those are opportunities for innovation. And it is time for news organizations to take that back and not see the audience relationship, not see the business model, and not see the data that we should own to help grow independent journalism to other companies who don't share our values.
Meisel, I'm hoping you can just lay out the other two recommendations, one on diversity and one on what we do about local journalism and the news deserts that are going on. And then I'd like Tom Rosenstiel to react. The first four on my right are commissioners, and we've invited Tom, who's head of the American Press Institute, to react to these recommendations.
Let me start with local because that's the world that I have inhabited for the last 30 plus years of my journalism career. And you know, there's no secret to anybody in this room that local media, particularly that which has traditionally been practiced by newspapers, is in the midst of a massive transition and transformation between legacy models and a digital future. But I want to frame the conversation in this way because, you know, we really approached it with this in mind, is that, you quality journalism has always been subsidized in some manner. Even if you go back to the colonial days, the first pamphleteers, if you will, were printers, and their primary business was honestly manning a printing press, as Ben Franklin that Tony cited in his introduction. And so, what will subsidize the collection, the reporting, the dissemination of quality journalism? And through eras, whether it was printing in colonial times, readers in the era of the penny press, advertising as classifieds became dominant in supporting the business model of newspapers, there's going to have to be some subsidy. And what we believe is that, and reinforce in our recommendations, is that the future support for independent local journalism is going to be comprised of a hybrid model. It's going to involve some infusion of dollars, and this is really one of the moonshot recommendations, is do we create a climate of philanthropy to subsidize the creation of new local journalism outlets across this country. One of the case studies is creation known as the American Journalism Project, which the Knight Foundation has graciously agreed to provide, which Knight Foundation is working to figure out how best to support. And other philanthropists. But how do you create new news organizations in communities that can provide that independent check on power, that independent look and examination of local institutions? Because in newspapers occupying that role historically, they had such economic power that they were able to maintain that independence. And that level of independence is what becomes threatened as the business model collapses.
And crucial to that was when we were looking at this, we didn't land on local right away. We actually took a really hard look at the research to say, where is the trust breaking down? So as we started to look at local communities, and in particular news deserts, when there isn't a local entity that's holding people accountable and corruption doesn't just show its face, there was no relationship that people had to their local media that was actually meaningful to them. Instead, what they were seeing is national media, which is important, but was always a second media to a lot of the people that were either interviewed or spoke to us personally, or in fact, multiple research projects now show that local media has really been a builder of trust. So that was a big orientation for us, is to actually identify that as one of the breaking points for us in America.
Finally, a journalism that is trusted in America is a journalism that looks like America. And survey after survey shows that news organizations across this country are falling short in meeting the goal of having newsrooms truly reflect in terms of race, in terms of gender, in terms of political perspective, and LGBTQ status, that fairness in media is truly when people across this country see themselves reflected in the coverage. And when newsrooms are not at parity with the communities that they serve, there we see misinterpretation, we see gaps in coverage, and we've seen that repeatedly as whether it's issues such as the police treatment of African Americans, we see the debate on gay marriage and gays in the military. We see in transgender issues and so forth. When those perspectives are not represented in newsrooms, there's something missing in the coverage. And so we strongly recommend that news organizations participate in the various surveys that are done to measure progress against that goal, and that news organizations rededicate themselves to building newsroom teams that reflect the communities they
And
serve.
it's a business imperative, right?
And political perspectives and geographic diversity being an important element as well. Tom, what are your reactions to where we are?
Well, I'll go fast. I hear the Oscar band in the background. First, I'd like to say, note, before you get to the recommendations of the report, the point on values in journalism. It says rededicate to the ideals of the profession. I know that the Commission heard various advice about this, including the idea that this was a special moment and that maybe journalism should become more of an activist force for resistance. That's a trap. When a despot says the press are the enemy of the people and the opposition, he or she is inviting the press into a briar patch, and the more they act like that, the more they will confirm exactly what the despot wants. And there was some discussion about that, and I think it's significant that the Commission said rededicate to, didn't take that bait. That does not mean don't change, however. Journalism is not stenography, and it needs to avoid the problem of false balance. And that's what leads, I think, to the recommendations. How to change and yet sustain the fundamentals. One of the things that the press and that people always do when they are trying to change in any industry, and they struggle with it, is they confuse their good intentions with good practice. That's where we fall down on bias. Journalists think they set out to be fair, they think they're being fair, and they don't see their own biases. And I agree with you, Charlie, that newsrooms have gotten more liberal over my lifetime in the profession, and that's a blinder. So a point about radical transparency as I go fast. It's the first recommendation. It's not simply a series of techniques. Radical transparency is a mindset. It's a spirit. It's a way you go about thinking about your relationship with the audience. And the purpose of radical transparency in journalism or anything else is to reveal your motivations and your intentions to the audience, to create a new relationship. So as you read these, don't think, oh, you do this, you do this. It's not a checklist. It's a culture change. I have one caution about the recommendation about expanding the financial base of journalism, and that it has to happen. There is no, there is no one silver bullet here. As you move into depending more on nonprofit money, it's important to know one bit of history, and that is that commercial journalism was insulated from pressure because it had so many advertisers that no one advertiser could push it around. As you move into philanthropic funding and you have significant funders, particularly in areas of coverage, there's a whole new set of ethics that we need to create and understand more deeply about how do you create insulation. Beware, I will say, after many years in journalism, of funders with good intentions. The last 2 points, real fast, Charlie, are when you think about technology and how you embrace it, yeah. I mean, in many ways, journalism's crisis now is not a technology crisis. It's a geographic crisis. It's about the decline of local interest in local news as people have more access to national news. It's about the nationalization of politics in our conversation. That has encouraged polarization. So when we say that we need more local journalism, it's not just about, well, we need to have people looking at the city council. That's how we change our democracy. That's how we restore the public or recover it. And so the technology that we embrace has got to understand what are the higher purposes of journalism. What is the technology for? Not just what can you do with it. And that leads to the last point. I cannot endorse Charlie's point more. Diversity means making your newsrooms not look like America, but making your newsrooms think like America. It means intellectual diversity, changing the way people think. If I hire people who have with a range of colors, but I all want them to be just like me, and they can't talk, and we can't argue, and there's no real diversity, there's no argument, there's no clash of ideas, I haven't accomplished anything. And I've not created diversity, and I've not, in the end, created the localism. One point that all of these things connect on is as we change the business model, and particularly connect more towards having readers pay for the journalism, there is a mission alignment between the content creators, between the news people, and the business people in newsrooms. Because suddenly, I've got to create things of such value that you will pay for it, as opposed to, you're a big mass audience, and I want to leverage you to advertisers who are my real customers. There's a tension there that gradually gets erased as we get more committed to creating value that readers will pay for.
Great. Well, thank you to this panel, and we're going to live change. As we have the next group come up, I should mention that the transparency meme goes through the whole report. It applies also to technology companies, and it applies to government. We can't just be transparent in the media. If we want to have the media report accurately, the government itself needs to be open and transparent as well. I mean, not in every aspect, but in some, and that's in the report. So, okay, Nuala O'Connor was our chairman of our little subgroup on the technology, and I think you'll start us off with, and to her right is Joanne Lippman, and Claire Wardle will comment. Claire runs the First Draft News, which looks at disinformation and technology.
Thank you so much, Charlie, and thank you all for being here today. I did wonder what I'd done to annoy Charlie that he put me in charge of this section, since it was one of the harder fought and a difficult one. But I'd like to point you first to the findings, because not only do they reflect some wonderful writing and thinking by members of the commission and Ethan Zuckerman, as we mentioned, Liz Woolery on my team at the Center for Democracy and Technology, but they reflect the real tension that we have here at a time when technology has so disrupted journalism and, frankly, perhaps our democracy. We are still trying to hold dear to what some of us thought the internet was all about at its dawn, the values of openness and equalization of opportunity and freedom of expression that was the vision, at least, of civil society at the dawn of the commercial internet. We are now more than a quarter century beyond that initial commercial internet, and it's well worth having the conversation about the fundamental legal and technological underpinnings that are the infrastructure of our vast communication system in this country and in many parts of the world. And we had some of that conversation. I think we really actually began some of that conversation about where we go in the United States and where we go elsewhere in the world in reining in the power of larger platforms and still promoting the voice of the individual. I think our work also echoes what you've heard in the other sections, which is the values of transparency, but also the really hard look we took at bias, both implicit and unintended, or very, very openly stated, the bias and the privilege of the creators of some of these technologies, and why the very fundamental architectures of the algorithms that fuel the way we learn and understand our democracy and our world reflect an existing power hierarchy, an existing structure, and how we can be mindful of breaking those barriers down, of staying true to our commitment to equality, to freedom of expression, to voice, but also to accuracy and truth and facts. And what is, and then I'll turn to our recommendations, and I'm going to talk to one, and Joanne's going to talk to the second. But the one I am so excited about is really the question we, at my organization, the Center for Democracy and Technology, and many of us on the Commission have been asking, what is the corporate social responsibility of companies in the digital age. As we've asked our industrial companies to clean up rivers and to fix the pollution to the environment that they have caused, what is the civic duty of a platform, of a company, of a purveyor of information that may or may not be true? What is the duty of care that these companies have to the individuals that they putatively serve? And so we've put that in the terms that some of you are familiar with from Jack Balkin at Yale and Jonathan Zittrain at Harvard, who is on the commission, the construct of the information fiduciary. But there are lots of ways to talk about it, whether it's data stewardship, information stewardship, editorial judgment. These are all ideas that we should be thinking about when a primary purpose of a construct is to provide information that is essential to one's citizenship and one's understanding of the democracy. So there are lots of iterations of data stewardship and information fiduciary. The one that you see in the report reflects the collection of individual data and the provision of information and news by an institution. I'm excited about that. You do see that moving into the dialogue here in Washington, D.C. on Capitol Hill, and I think I would just say watch this space for legislative, regulatory, and other actions to rebalance the power between the self and the state, the self and the institution. Joanne, do you want to talk about number 6?
Sure. I want to talk for a couple of minutes here about transparency, radical transparency, which is what we talked about with journalism. We believe it applies equally to the technology industry. And this, I have to say, it was also, I think, among these recommendations we're talking about, were also among the most radical of all of the recommendations that are coming out of the commission. It was, as you've heard, very difficult conversations were had between, on the one hand, you've got journalists, and on the other hand, you've got Google and Facebook and technology firms that sometimes have competing interests, would sometimes be frenemies, in that the business model of the technology firms and the social media platforms is they want us to share information. That is the core of how they do business, how they sell advertising, depends on all of us sharing information. What we also learned, though, is that it turns out that false information on social media spreads faster than true information. There is a study that we actually referenced in the report that analyzed more than 100,000 news stories and rumors shared on Twitter. The most popular false stories reached 100 times as many people as the most popular true news stories. And we also learned in listening to various parties on the commission that the emotion that spreads fastest is actually anger, outrage. And so all of us as users are being sort of incentivized to share sort of poor quality information. And yet that is good for the business model of the technology firms. And that's why I think it was so revolutionary, and I give so much credit to our colleagues on the commission who come from those companies to come together and have a candid conversation about that and about what can we do about that. And so that's why the transparency recommendation, I think, is so vital. So you'll see there are 3 recommendations within that. One is tools to trace the origin of the news story. We know that bad actors have hijacked social media both before the election, but even now, just last week, Facebook and Twitter purged hundreds of false accounts, spreading misinformation, originating from Russia, Iran, and other bad actors. There are technological resources and human resources that we can put into addressing that and finding the source and rooting out the bad actors. There's another element to this that that also is will help us going forward, I think, in terms of disclosing funding sources for all ads. And this is an interesting way of looking at this. So the tech platforms now get the vast majority of all advertising, which is one of the reasons why journalism is so stressed in terms of its own business model. And yet, there's a lot of opacity around who is paying for this advertising. So in the wake of the 2016 election, there has been movement on the part of the technology firms, the social media firms, and on the part of the federal government to say we really need to understand the source of the funding. But the commission goes further because our feeling is, and we have seen it in practice, that in trying in an automated way to get to political advertising, sometimes there are mistakes. Sometimes a New York Times story or a Politico story gets misclassified as advertising, as having a political point of view. So our recommendation is that all ads have, we can see the source of funding. There's transparency, the source of funding for all advertising online. And then finally, this transparency about algorithms, which you'll see under this recommendation, could have really far-reaching impact. And again, this is one of those moonshot recommendations. But if you think about the issue that we all have with these echo chambers and filter bubbles, the idea that the algorithms are the secret sauce of the technology firms. And so they guard them very, very closely. But the algorithms are essentially acting as editors. They are choosing the information that we see in our news feeds. And yet we have no sort of visibility into how or why that is being done. And so we are recommending that a glass box approach, as we call it, which is so that we, the users, can understand in plain English what is personalized, why it's personalized, to what extent it's personalized, and also what we as users can do to control the customization. And the hope there is that once we have a better understanding of the filters that are put around the information that we see, that we can do something actually as users to also sort of break out of our own filter bubbles.
And Nuala, maybe the last.
Recommendation 7 really gets to drilling down on the idea that just as technology got us into this problem, it's going to get us out of this problem by experimenting and thinking creatively about structures to enforce and reinforce and enhance the idea of more power and control in the rights of the human. I want to especially highlight the construct, which I think Tony mentioned, the idea of data portability. And this draws again on the theme of information fiduciary and balancing the power between the individual and their own data. You should know I personally am a little bit of a skeptic about this call to regulate in an antitrust sense the size and scale of the platform. Small companies have a lot of data as well, and so the idea that an individual has the right to port their data and to create a new persona at a new platform, whether social media or otherwise, is certainly being met with some resistance by companies because data is oil, data is the lifeblood of the digital economy, whatever analogy you want to create, but data is also a part of self, and so this is, I think, an exciting thing we're going to see more of in tech and non-tech competitive spaces as well. So number 7 really gets to the idea of thinking about the creative spaces and collaborative spaces these platforms are providing for discourse and dialogue, and making sure we are understanding, at the very least, transparency around terms of use and policies about how the data is handled and collected, and the impact that that's having on discourse online.
Great. Claire, you've been studying disinformation to a tremendous amount, and you're really in touch with the whole community that's doing this, which is a great academic and active community. And what's your reaction to these recommendations?
Thanks, Charlie, and thank you for inviting me to give comments and also to manage to write a report by committee. I was involved by a very similar process with the EU Commission this time last year, and it nearly was the end of me. So congratulations on getting through the process. So overall, I just want to say how struck I was by the emphasis on responsibility throughout this report. For me, whether you're a journalist, researcher, policymaker, just someone working at a technology company, I really do think we have to say, how will history judge us? I think it's no small thing to say all of us have to be having that conversation at the moment. And how do we make sure that we're thinking about potential harms and unintended consequences now, not in 10 years' time or 30 years' time when the historian writes that book? So we've had 2.5 years of talking, convenings, let's just say it, tinkering around the edges. And I really do think that now is a time for experimentation and evaluation based on truly global conversations involving the smartest minds, as well as the input and lived experiences of those people who use these platforms every single day. And I know that was a big part of this commission. And so while I completely understand that this report is written with the US in mind, some of you who are good at accents will know that I'm not from the US. And so the major challenge we have when thinking about technology companies is that they are global in scale, and the decisions they make every day are global in outlook by necessity. So we have to recognize that when we're thinking about these types of interventions, how can technology companies think about these when they think about global scale? So in terms of the 3 sets of recommendations, just some reactions. Firstly, information fiduciaries. Not only is it the best word in the English language, since I heard Jonathan Zitran and Jack Bolkin talk about this idea, I was convinced it was something that we need to explore further, so I'm really glad it's made its way into the report. But we do need to think more about the specific details of how this works. You know, for lawyers and accountants and doctors, for individuals, we understand that. How does it work in terms of a technology company? And how can we consider other mechanisms for strengthening privacy in terms of opt-in consent for data sharing, more transparency about how personal data is being used to drive targeted ads, and just clearer wording for terms of service agreements. Like, we keep talking about it, and they just get longer and longer. So secondly, recommendations connected to transparency. I'm not going to lie, I'm a big fan of the actual use of radical transparency. I know it makes people nervous, and I know it in particular makes the technology companies nervous. But it is a word that gets thrown around endlessly, and we do need to think about specific mechanisms by which transparency becomes the norm. So the first idea about investigating provenance, I couldn't agree more. Fact-checking is wonderful, but I increasingly am talking about the need for source checking, the ability in real time to have tools that allows either journalists or my mum to work out the provenance of not just a news story, but a meme, a video, an image. There are real challenges here around how information moves across these platforms. These tech companies think about themselves, not recognizing the much broader ecosystem and how information travels. Secondly, yes, yes, yes to transparency for all online ads. We've worked now on 6 elections around the world. Disinformation agents, both foreign and domestic, understand that it's not really about political advertising. It's advertising that's trying to shift different social views and take advantage of those social and cultural tensions and religious tensions that exist within a country. So there isn't a clear line. The platforms are going to push back because the scale is so hard, but we have to enforce that. And lastly, this suggestion about algorithmic transparency. I'm not surprised the technology companies were shaking in their boots when you said that. But the recent research from Pew that showed that most Americans don't understand that their Facebook newsfeed is algorithmically determined shows the more we can actually educate Americans about the power of algorithms, the more they're going to say, well, hang on, how am I only seeing that friend and not this friend? How come I'm seeing this news report and not that report? So the more we push, the more I think we're going to get momentum from the American public. And so finally, the recommendations connected to innovation. We do need to make sure that these are driven by research, that we have clear definitions, we understand user needs, and are properly evaluated. One of the recommendations was developing metrics for a healthy online dialogue. Now that sounds great, and we all nod, but what does that actually mean, and how do we ensure that that isn't just written up on a whiteboard at a US university on the coast with really well-meaning academics, but it's not actually driven by empiricism and what a healthy dialogue means. The other point about how do we discourage sharing of disinformation is so important. There's an academic called Nathan Matthias who's done incredible work on nudge technology. If you remind people in a forum not to share until you've checked, lo and behold, we do slow down and we do stop and check. So we need to supercharge those efforts, but most importantly, we need full buy-in from the platforms so that they will share the data with us afterwards to tell us whether or not those experiments worked, even if it means people spent less time on their platform and it impacted the bottom line, which takes us back to responsibility. Where do we want to be in 30 years' time, and what did we actually do? And so yes to data portability. The network effect something like Facebook has means that developers say, why should I even try? Everybody's on Facebook. So again, there's going to be pushback on that, and the report does a good job of talking about privacy issues around moving somebody's data, but we have to think really innovatively about that. And the last idea was one that I was particularly excited about, which was the idea of a multi-stakeholder forum. which I'm actually working on a project right now, not just for technology companies, but for the information commons as a whole. How can we bring together those smartest minds and the American people? So in conclusion, while I think the report's recommendations highlight the most persuasive ideas for tackling the issues we see today with media and democracy, there are a couple of suggestions I would have liked to have seen. One is we do need access to platform data for independent, accredited researchers and journalists. It is a priority. People constantly ask me, what's the impact of these disinformation campaigns? We can't answer until we get that data. And we shouldn't be writing regulation until we have that data. So the platform companies, in their interest, they're going to have really poorly written regulation unless they can give us some of that data. And the second, we can't disproportionately focus on the big players. We have to understand this whole ecosystem, closed messaging apps, many other different types of players in this space that get ignored because we're so focused on Facebook, Google, and Twitter. And so very finally, the time is for experimentation and evaluation. And I'm just going to say this as a British person. I was, of course, very taken by the reference in the reports, the creation of the BBC almost a century ago in 1922. And I know in this country, people would like to think that the BBC is a state-sponsored broadcaster. But what I love is those Reithian principles of how do we inform, educate, and entertain? How do we build trustworthy digital technologies with that in mind? How can we think big with data portability and algorithmic transparency to really think about something for the public good? And so I would just push you when we think about these recommendations. They really are strong, but the time is now, and so we need to be even more ambitious.
Thank you, and thanks for this panel. So now, last but not very important is the recommendations on citizenship. And in the end, we can talk about the journalists, we can talk about the platforms, but in the end, it is we as citizens who need to take responsibility for the government that we vote and for the media that we see. So Charlie Sykes was on the commission and spearheaded the citizenship recommendations, and Jeff Rosen, head of the National Constitutional Center, will react. Thanks. Charlie?
Well, one of the most important things I think about this commission report, and was reflected by Tony's comments a little bit earlier, is that I think the commission had a real sense of urgency about the particular moment and the seriousness of the threat we face. That this is kind of a fire bell to say that we do have a crisis of democracy, and I think we've discussed this. And in a sense, I think we kind of reverse engineered it as we go through all of the misinformation and the division in society. I favor all of the recommendations for dealing with the platforms, although I'm somewhat skeptical. Are we going to be able to fix Facebook and Google? Are we going to be able to change all of that? So one of the things we began to think about was, we know that there is this massive misinformation out there, but how do we explain the fact that there are so many gullible Americans who believe it? How do we explain the breakdown of our democratic norms beyond simply the failures of the elites? And it's become almost fashionable now to say that we are all victims of this, that this has been done to us. But I think that what the commission has ultimately decided is that there is a crisis of citizenship. It's us, that nobody's going to come in as a white horse and wave a wand and change this if the American people have forgotten or not learned what the values, the history, and the institutions of this country are about. One of the phrases you've heard frequently has been the phrase moonshot. This is real moonshot here. And the analogy that we talked about on the commission was that moment in the late 1950s when the Russians launched Sputnik, and Americans began to realize, wow, maybe we are now paying the price for not teaching our children about mathematics and science. Well, what's happened in the last couple of years is, in a sense, a civic Sputnik moment, where we are realizing, wow, we are really paying a rather dramatic price for not teaching history, not teaching the institutions of the country. Civics education has been allowed to wither away. Now, this is my term, it's not in the report, but I think there are real consequences for dumbing down the American people when it comes to all of this. The assumption that we all relied upon, that Americans knew how our system of government worked, understood what the constitutional balances between the various elements of government were. But what if they don't? What if we've been drawing down this reservoir of democratic values and democratic knowledge? We just assume that it's there, and then we wake up and find out, well, these are much more fragile than we ever thought. So to the recommendations, that we think that it's time for a rather dramatic revitalization of civics education in this country. Not just as a mandate for K-12 education, but across the board, that Americans need to relearn these constitutional values. They need to relearn their history, in part to remember what it means to be a citizen. This concept of citizen, which has many rights but also has responsibilities, and a citizen that is also linked to one another in ways that sometimes I think we forget. We don't have a shared narrative in this country anymore. Increasingly, it's us versus them, red versus blue, and the citizenship is, I think, part of all of that. So number one is civics education, and one of the more radical proposals that we made was that every, and we're not into mandates, we're more into suggestions, that every high school graduate, before they vote for the first time, should at least have the knowledge to pass the U.S. citizenship test. To say, okay, here we have just a model, that we don't allow people to come in and become citizens and vote unless they have a certain body of knowledge. Well, why not have that for Americans as well? Paired with this, obviously, is a recommitment to digital literacy, which we've been talking about implicitly throughout the whole morning here, which is that at some point we need to focus on how do you educate the American people to handle this explosion of information? How do you somehow restore the immune system of the American mind to what we're seeing right now? Because I do think that whether it is ignorance, indifference, or gullibility, we do have a lot of Americans who are not prepared to deal with the democratic dialogue and debates that we have right now. So you have to have civic literacy. We need to have a dramatic commitment to digital literacy. We are not prescriptive in saying, because nobody on the commission is naive about the difficulties of education reform, but this also does not require reinventing the wheel, as I think you're going to hear from Jeffrey. There are people who have devoted tremendous resources to coming up with curricula for civic education, for digital literacy. The question is whether or not we as a country are committed to do it. And finally, we come up with a proposal which I think is ripe, which is to say, at some point, if we are going to revitalize citizenship, we need to change the relationship of individuals to one another and to society through a system or a recommitment to voluntary, when I'll stress that word, voluntary national service. And this is something that the Aspen Institute has dealt with in the past. I think this is a bipartisan potential moment for Americans to find some sense of shared purpose. It is that we narrative that we lack as a country, that we don't think of ourselves as Americans. Now, there are a lot of obviously technical issues involved in national service, voluntary national service, but there are models, and we cite them in the report, that can be scaled up. But also, I think it's the conceptual approach to say that, look, as Americans, we ought to act as Americans. We ought to have some way in which we can experience our civic obligations. William F. Buckley Jr. At one point wrote a whole book about gratitude. Said, I'm not sure that national service will necessarily solve all of our problems, but it's a way for Americans to give back, to understand that, you know, this country has done so many wonderful things for us. What can we do? Can we do this? So those are the three main recommendations. There's also the revitalization of civic spaces to allow and facilitate Americans to talk with one another. I am constantly amazed because I spend way too much time on social media. I mean, I'm one of the bad guys on this. I spend way too much time on Twitter. And so when I come to an event like this or anywhere else where there's actually real people, I'm really always amazed by how reasonable and thoughtful and kind people are. Because if you spend time on social media, you will think we're all at each other's throats, and that every conversation is like, how can I insult you? How can I do this? When in fact, if Americans talk with one another, I think that, and that we're not naive that there's a magic bullet there, but there are institutions in this country that can facilitate that. And it is that revitalization of civic life that I think that we need. It's and because social media can't compensate for that loss. I mean, we are a society where, bowling alone, where we've become so atomized, we don't actually talk to one another, and we're not going to fix any of these problems or trust one another unless we have those dialogues. One last comment before I turn it over to Jeffrey. One of the things that strikes me is that you can debate almost every issue if there is an assumption of goodwill on the part of the other person. If there is that assumption, then you can understand that every disagreement on an issue is not necessarily an indictment of the character or the principles of the other person, but that's one of the things that we are lacking in our country. So again, these are the three things: a dramatic recommitment to civics education, to digital literacy, and perhaps to the concept of citizenship as embodied through voluntary national service.
Thank you so much, Charlie. Thank you for the report, and thanks for asking me to respond. I think you are absolutely right, and the Commission is absolutely right, that a Sputnik moment for civic education is the key to preserving the future of the American Republic. Tony is right to start with Benjamin Franklin and Washington and Madison believed that without education in the science of government, as Washington put it, we would degenerate into the Athenian mob. Jefferson said democracy cannot survive ignorant and free, and the founders thought that unless citizens understood the structures of government, then we would be guided by reason, by passion rather than reason, and the entire experiment would collapse. So the first set of recommendations are crucially important. I want to disaggregate the three recommendations. One is standards, the second is the substance of what's supposed to be taught, and the third is funding. On standards, I don't think there's going to be a lot of disagreement. A number of states have adopted a requirement that kids pass the citizenship test to graduate from high school. We saw the noble but painful experience of the Common Core standards, which were broadly adopted, requiring civics and then became politically controversial. Most public schools do have some kind of civics requirement, although they're not allowed to use the words Common Core. And the bottom line is that there are a lot of standards and requirements, but not an agreement about what substantively should be taught to address the crisis in civic knowledge. Those statistics that the report quotes: a third of Americans can't name a single branch of government. Only a third can name all three. A majority of college students believe that the First Amendment allows the banning of hate speech, although the Supreme Court has unanimously held the opposite. This is a substantive crisis in civic knowledge, and the question is how to address it. It's going to have to be done in the nonprofit sphere, and you note a lot of organizations, including the National Constitution Center, that are trying to address it. At the Aspen Ideas Festival last July, David Coleman, the head of the College Board, announced a path-breaking partnership with the Constitution Center, where the Constitution Center has created a curriculum to teach all 3 to 5 million advanced placement students about the essence of the First Amendment. This online course, which is platformed on our interactive Constitution, combines the top liberal and conservative scholars in America to talk about the essence of the First Amendment, what they agree and disagree about, videos with Supreme Court Justices Kagan and Gorsuch talking about the First Amendment, lesson plans for high school kids and then middle school kids about essential First Amendment questions, and most excitingly, constitutional exchanges that unite classrooms in red and blue America, Philadelphia and Kentucky, or California and North Dakota, to talk about First Amendment issues. It's an amazing platform, and it is necessary to bring it not only to AP kids, but to all kids in America, to underserved kids, to charter school kids, to public school kids. So the distribution of a curriculum like this is crucially important. And I'm talking about substantive constitutional knowledge, Supreme Court case law, the principle that, as the Supreme Court has said, speech can only be banned if it's intended to and likely to cause imminent violence. That principle from the Whitney and California case in 1927, reaffirmed in Brandenburg in 1969, is something that all of us must know and explain to our kids and apply to current controversies. This leads to the central question of funding. And I think you are absolutely right to call on philanthropists to fund substantive constitutional education. And I want, sitting here at Aspen in this distinguished setting, to say that American foundations and philanthropists have not been sufficiently attentive to funding substantive civic knowledge. The great foundations, Rockefeller and Carnegie and Annenberg, who you quoted, who in the 1980s devoted substantial resources to substantive civic knowledge, have ceased to do so. The National Constitution Center's Interactive Constitution, which has gotten 20 million hits since it launched only 3 years ago, is funded, and I need to thank these generous funders, the John Templeton Foundation, the Niarchos Foundation, the Charles Koch Foundation, which is now trying to build bipartisan coalitions, have funded this, but the overall funding for civic education at a Niarchos conference is less than 1% of all philanthropic funding. And it's a disgrace. And this curriculum is not going to be created without philanthropic funding. And what we need to do is fund substantive knowledge so people can actually identify the three branches of government. When we have Justices Gorsuch and Sotomayor going on Good Morning America and saying that it's a national scandal, and we have this Knight Commission agreeing with this, then we need to fund the substance of this curriculum. So it's important that Knight is committed to this effort. And you must, Alberto, bring in your fellow foundation heads and create coalitions of philanthropists, both foundations and individuals, so this is actually funded, both the substantive curriculum and the distribution of it. And that's the most tangible thing that this important commission can do. It can actually fund the creation of bipartisan civics curriculum and help it get distributed to millions of kids across America. So the philanthropists have not done a good enough job recently. They've been distracted by politically contested functions. And that leads to the second category, which is civic engagement. Recently, in the past 10 years, civics has become polarized between those who want to get out the vote, who tend to be Democrats, and those at the moment who think that that's a partisan effort, who tend to be Republicans. It's too bad that we're at a stage in our national history where the effort to declare Election Day a national holiday is considered a partisan event, but that's where we are. So we have to accept that and not confuse efforts to get out the vote with substantive constitutional knowledge and focus on actually teaching people about the Constitution. That's why I think your second category of recommendations of simply bringing together people of different perspectives for face-to-face dialogues, although digital platforms can be helpful, are crucial. As the second panel said, people confronted with opposite points of view online on Twitter tend to become more polarized and more dug into their position than before. However, people who unite for face-to-face discussions over a period of time often open their minds to the arguments on the other side. And that's why I'm so excited about these virtual exchanges where kids can sign up on Zoom. And it's really thrilling to see a classroom in Kentucky talking to a classroom in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania about the First Amendment moderated by a judge about whether the First Amendment protects hate speech. And that is scalable, and it can bring together tens of thousands, millions of citizens for thoughtful dialogue and debate. And that second recommendation is absolutely crucial in this regard. National service is a noble goal. I happen to support it. General McChrystal came to the Constitution Center recently, and I admire the work Aspen is doing. I think it's a different goal than the effort to promote substantive constitutional and civics knowledge, to distribute it and to fund it. And therefore, I wouldn't lump them in together. And if you can build support for it, that would be great. And it's very much in the Washingtonian spirit of civic republicanism. But it's a separate set of issues. But I just want to end by emphasizing, oh, and here's one other piece. Digital literacy is important, but it's not the same as constitutional knowledge. Yes, it's important for people to be able to distinguish fake from real news. It's important for them to be able to use the web thoughtfully, and for all of us to stay off Twitter, because simple self-restraint and reading the Federalist Papers, which are so long that AP teachers have stopped assigning them and actually have to read them out loud in class now because kids won't take the time to read them on their own. Isn't that, that was the most sobering thing I learned recently from an AP teacher. You can't even assign the Federalist Papers because they're too long. And originally, the Federalist Papers were published in the Pennsylvania Packet newspaper, which we have at the Constitution Center, for all citizens to read. They were published in the newspaper because the founders had faith that, as Madison put it, citizens reading long and complicated arguments could create a republic of letters guided by a group that he called the literati, to be guided by reason. So that's really, that's a real problem. When, in order to teach the Federalist Papers, you have to read it out loud and discuss it. But we need to teach the Federalist Papers, and we need to teach the basic structures of government so people can pass the citizenship test, and not confuse that with using digital media thoughtfully and having good digital habits, which is important, but again, a separate set of issues. So that is my the takeaway from this crucial third section of the report. It is urgently important to fund substantive educational initiatives that will teach people about the Constitution, and it is urgently important to bring together citizens of different perspectives to discuss them, and most importantly, it is urgently important for America's philanthropists, the great foundations and individuals, to support this effort, because if you don't, this material will not be created and this constitutional light will not be spread. So the future of the Republic does indeed depend on this effort. Thank you so much.
So the report ends with these two sentences. We are citizen sovereigns. We must act as sovereigns, take responsibility, and move forward. I want to thank all of the commissioners, the foundation, the people who are in attendance here for taking the responsibility of looking at these recommendations and then acting on them. As I think Tony or maybe Jamie said at the beginning, these are intended as beginning points. It is an ongoing dialogue. We know that there are other opinions that the commissioners and others will be expanding on. We urge you to tune in to the hashtag Nightcom Twitter message. And I think we can take one or two questions, and that's about it, because we did run a little longer. Yeah. Mike Nelson.
I'm Mike Nelson. I used to teach at Georgetown, and the most popular class I taught was on scenario planning. I'm curious whether the commissioners spent any time looking at scenarios, and particularly looking at what could happen if there was a really big disaster, a cyber attack that closed down electric grid, bioweapons. Is our media ready to tell people what is happening and what they need to do in case of a really serious 1906 San Francisco earthquake type event?
No.
No.
No and no.
And no, right.
Next question.
Hi, Alex Howard. So I've written a lot about transparency in journalism. The past couple of years. I worked at a local nonprofit focused on sunshine and government, and I saw something really upsetting happen the last couple of years, which is the nation has become polarized around press freedom, around views of the press, and around the very idea that the public should be informed based upon shared facts. And we're going in the wrong direction, have gone in the wrong direction for a couple of years now without our political leaders, without our civic society coming up with an idea to do something about that, in no small part because of a person who has not been named here. So let's say Voldemort down the street is going to be talking about our union, which is profoundly divided right now and polarized. The Knight Foundation has done an amazing job in bringing together people to talk about this. But I don't see nationalists in the room. I don't see populism directly confronted here. And I'm concerned because my colleagues in other countries, whether they're in Hungary or Poland, whether they're trying to report on what's happening in the Philippines, they're being imprisoned. They're being murdered. Try to report upon organized crime in Mexico. yes, there's a crisis in democracy. Yes, I agree with all of these recommendations. But what can we or should we do beyond just going to vote in 2 years, right now, to address a hate movement against journalism within our own borders and the existence of polarization that has been exacerbated against the very shared values that I think are fundamental to American democracy? What should we do about that? Because it can't just be saying newsrooms fix it.
Okay, Charlie?
Well, I will point out that there is language in this report that directly addresses the president's comments. And we discussed that at great length on the commission, how to deal with that. And ultimately, I think there was a consensus that you cannot talk about trust, media, and democracy without talking about the fact that we have political leaders who are using that wedge to score political points, and the fact that you have the press being characterized as the enemy of the people. So we did address that, and there is, I mean, that doesn't mean that we have a solution for it, but you're absolutely right. At some point, there has to be some pushback on all of that, that we can disagree on these issues, but the demonization and the attacks on the news media itself pose a real significant threat to our ability to engage in these dialogues. Now, again, that doesn't mean that the media does not, have to do things to fix itself, but the demagogic, over-the-top attacks do need to be confronted, and I give the commission a great deal of credit for weighing in on that.
One last question is over there. Sorry, yes.
Hi there. One quick question I had.
And just identify yourself.
Oh, yes.
Please.
My name is Sean Mickens. I had a specific question around how you tackled a question around generations, particularly on the citizenship portion. Most of the recommendations that you shared so far seems as though they focus very heavily on kids. But most of the voting population for the next couple of generations are people who are long past the portion of needing to take a graduation exam. So I'm just very curious, like, how are we weaving in better ways that the existing voting demographics in this country are able to address this issue? Because I think the way we're talking about it is that it's slightly more timely than waiting for generations of students to go through this education process.
I'm really glad you asked that point, because, yeah, I mean, it's, part of it is, it is going to be hard to educate the American people, so let's, focus on the future generation. But what is the problem right now is the people who are voting. Well, this is the kind of things that Jeffrey is working on, and we do talk about the need to engage the entire population in this kind of relearning of civic values. So, yes, that is a legitimate point. It would be wrong to simply put the entire burden on the kids or on K-12 education. That obviously is not going to be sufficient. It's necessary, but not sufficient. If you want, I mean, and Jeffrey's work is, I think, much of it is aimed at the population as a whole. Right.
We must be lifelong learners of the Constitution. That was Jefferson and Brandeis's point, and it's great that the commission recommends that civics be taught in colleges and undergrad. And adults have to be engaged through public programs, and the same virtual exchanges that can unite classrooms can also unite adults. And this interactive Constitution and other materials like it, I learn from it every day, and you should too. And we have a response. In the end, it just comes back to ourselves. We need to spend our time cultivating our faculties of reason and not tweeting and surfing and browsing. And that's on all of us each day, and we have to inspire our fellow citizens.
I'm going to tweet out that
to be
comment.
Lifelong learners as well. Don't wait until after the show. Great point. Really, really, really important.
So I want to just take this opportunity to thank everyone for today and everyone that made today possible. I just want to. I'm worried a little bit that we may have given some false impression, and I just want to clarify. Are politicians capable of using fear and anger to divide us? They are. They have been for a very long time. The antidote to that, there are many, but the most powerful are the people. This commission, I think we were absolutely unified in our faith in the citizenry of all ages. Yes, you can inflame, and yes, the technology reinforces the divisions. But we are capable of something very different than that. The history of the country tells us that we are capable. And the key, I think, and many of the comments today is, we looked for technological fixes for this. I confess, I walked into the commission thinking, we'll just tweak the algorithms and make you confront stuff you don't like and agree with. And I was informed and learned how that might backfire. But I think the key that I heard in this regard was, you can't start with people who are violently opposed and just say, okay, now work it out. You have to develop trust even between those two people first, or between the classroom or the library in two different parts of the country. We have to begin that work, and it begins with us. And I believe, and I think the Commission fully believes, that the American people, and beyond America, because these are global issues, we are capable of this. We are capable of better, of letting the better angels win, changing our tools and our approach so that they don't feed the lesser angels of our spirits. We're betting on the people, we, the people. Thank you all for being here today.
Well, that was great. That was, of course.